afternoon, everyone. Today, I hope you are able to hear me. There's no problem. Swamiji, are you able to hear me? Yes. Okay, perfect. Today we have the honor and privilege of having Swami Shyama Chaitanya with us, who will be talking on role of dialogue in social change. Shyama Chaitanya is a monk pursuing his spiritual calling in Rishikesh. He was a student of Hindu College, Delhi University, and started his professional career as a lecturer in the Delhi College of Arts and Commerce in the early 1990s. He switched several jobs and worked in multiple sectors, including academia, media, government, NGOs, and aid agencies. But he never felt truly fulfilled. After having worked with the World Bank for a decade, he called it a day and moved to Rishikesh, beckoning by his inner calling in order to pursue the study of Upanishads and other philosophical scriptures under the learned guidance of Acharyas of the Kailash Ashram. He spends his time studying, walking along the Ganges, traveling, and counseling people in distress. Swami Chaitanya, you're welcome. You have up to 3 hours for today's session. You can make presentation for an hour or so, and then we can move on for questions and answers and discussion. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. It would be good if you can speak about a couple of minutes about the profile of the students to give me a good impression. You have, of course, mentioned that many of them are academics.
Yes. Yeah. So we have 29 students, Swamiji. They are from different states of India and also from neighboring countries: Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, and the UK. We have students, and India, of course. We have students from these countries, and most of them are masters or PhD students, mostly from social science background, but also there are some students who are students of. So yes.
Okay, thank you. So, I was actually requested to speak about the tradition of dialogue in Hinduism, but I thought that I would rather choose a topic where I have been involved directly as a professional over a long period of time, working with NGOs and aid agencies and the World Bank and different projects. So I thought that this would be more useful going forward for the students who look for careers maybe as experts in dialogue and mediation, and religious dialogue is fine. That is one aspect of it, and we could always have a conversation on that on a later date. But I thought this would be much more, it's more of a bread and butter issue. And this is so critical to the way we plan, design, visualize, implement, and maintain it after the projects are over in different sectors, that I thought this is a topic that I prefer to talk about. To tell a little about what exactly I was doing at the World Bank, I was actually a part of the social development team, which I left the job about 4 years back. So my main job was actually to talk to different project-affected communities, do social assessments, and ensure that community consultations are held, and the government works in a way that is accountable, it's transparent, and people are not excluded from the benefit, and they're more meaningfully consulted, and the views taken into account, and the projects flow. So the World Bank has some tough policies, which is called social safeguards and environmental safeguards policies. Sometimes there's a tussle between the World Bank and the government. But this has been a big learning experience. Even earlier, when I was working for a while in the NGOs, when you enter new villages, if you tomorrow work for any civil society, if you have to work, then to establish community rapport, to plan a certain community level development initiative, you have to talk to people. You have to have them on board, otherwise it doesn't work. Now, this whole process is kind of so critical that despite a lot of professional skills in terms of your academic understanding of the issues, if you do not reach the ground, if you don't hit the ground with an ability to talk to people and listen to them, nothing works. And a lot of these development models, which were implemented following in India, especially following the Soviet model, didn't work. We had poverty alleviation programs for decades. Poverty is all around us. So now, this presentation, I've sort of very hurriedly sort of put together a few things based on my experience. So it's not a very academic presentation. It's mostly from my experience and mostly based on the practice aspects. So when we talk about development, democracy, and people, and the importance of consultation and dialogue for social change, you have to sort of look at the larger context in which we are talking about it. So, end of the day, most of the countries that you represent come from are democracies. And democracies are not top-down models. There are accountability mechanisms. The governments are accountable. They are voted to and out of power every few years. And then you have sometimes strong, sometimes weak. You have the press, and now we have social media where people can talk, they can come up and participate, they can express their opinions against the government, against a certain initiative. Sometimes this expression of opinion may be misled. It might slow down the decision-making process, but it can also provide a lot of inputs. In fact, this sudden explosion of the social media has made our urgent need to focus more on dialogue even more pressing, because earlier it was a more formal way of organizing a dialogue. So we could sort of document your meeting minutes, disclose them, and say, we have done this, we have done that. But it seems it's kind of an ongoing process now with the big social media coming in the picture. So the government is kind of overloaded with a lot of information. People are overloaded with a lot of information. But what sort of flows down as an opinion, what is counted, what is taken note of, is sometimes very arbitrary, and you do not know how it works. So we have to keep that in mind. And then, of course, the civil society. Of course, all countries are not very fortunate to have very strong established civil societies like in India or in UK, from where some people are there. There are countries where they have democracies, but the civil society is not extremely strong. If by civil society we are talking about active, participative NGOs. Countries which may not be doing very badly economically, like Sri Lanka, is a very efficient government, but they don't have a very strong NGO sector. Okay, but they have their own. I would mention a little about Sri Lanka, where we did a project. On the other hand, you have a country like Nepal, which is a very small country, and in terms of economic performance, it may not be very strong, but in terms of dialogue and participation and openness, it's very strong in that particular arena. And then you have a lot of.
Swamiji, I'm sorry for interrupting. Do you want me to share this screen? I haven't started this screen share yet.
Yeah. Please start this. Please start the presentation.
Yeah. I thought you would ask me to do that. Okay, I will do it.
Please do. Yeah, let's have the presentation. Yeah. So if you look at the first slide, this whole democratic setup in which we are functioning. So we have media, civil society, and what is more, it makes it even more challenging is that diverse interest groups are operational. Earlier in India, for example, we had a mixed economy where we would have a very strong government, few trade unions, social groups organized around identities or regional identities or social identities. But with economy becoming much more complex, you have different new associations coming into picture, and that's the case with all advanced differentiated societies. The society, the more it gets functionally differentiated, the more number of associations and interest groups become more active, and they all are negotiating with the government for more favorable resource allocation, which will sort of address their needs and concerns. And then the framework, in democracy is essentially a representative system. But back in the 70s and 80s, this is this. So, it's a representative system, but representation is not the best way to reflect people's opinion. It's at best an imperfect democratic system. So, by representation, I mean we are sending some people to the government, and they are supposed to tell the policymakers to drive our opinion, but they may be representing some other corporate interests or certain political interests. It may not be the best way to represent all citizens. And therefore, this representative system, in order to make it more accountable, we have the judiciary, we have different other mechanisms where the executive, which is like the kitchen, where the inputs from the people, if you look at a systems approach, are kind of. So, we have the representative system and the judiciary to sort of make the government more accountable, and the executive arm, which is responsible for sort of converting the inputs, the demand functions to the people, to sort of convert them into deliveries, to supply side. And that sort of also has mechanisms built into it where it can even take more information so that it can do midterm corrections and make its planning process more efficient. The whole thing even gets more challenging, more difficult to deal with, because we have multiple institutions even within the government. So dialogue is just not about dialogue between government and the people, or dialogue between the immediate delivery agency and the people surrounding it, the beneficiaries or the adversely impacted people, but the need for an efficient system of coordination and dialogue between different departments. And in the course of my experience, what I've seen is it's much more challenging to ensure different departments talking to each other in a very complex federal democratic system, because everybody have their own legal identities. And it's very difficult to get all of them on board to ensure a very quick decision-making process in a very diverse institutional framework like India's, and then the case is same in several other countries. Now, when it comes to how these things are related, because whatever development that we're intending to achieve, the development results have to be planned, executed, and monitored within this complex cobweb of institutional relations, and also meeting people's aspirations. So it's a very, very complex ecosystem. And the social development goals, we had the Millennium Development Goals. Now we have a few more SDGs, which are stated by the UN, and it's on the top of the table of different funding agencies. Of course, they prioritize and they decide what are the ones they want to give importance to and priority, and do their funding and their evaluation accordingly. Some of the key areas where you see that dialogue is very important, and it's very important to make it participative, that it cannot just be a highly technocratic solution, is in the areas of building infrastructure, because that's so crucial for economic development. You need connectivity. A lot of countries did wonderfully well when the rural transport system was improved. Then the whole value chain improved, in the agricultural value chain improved, and the farmers benefited. Many of the, I had gone to Gujarat in some project, and I found that the rural roads were better. And I was asking, when did it start? But it started with the Amul experiment, where Mr. Kurian, who sort of visualized the whole thing, was a visionary. He told the government that if you want dairy sector to work, you have to have wonderful rural roads. So the person who is sort of carrying from these cooperative milk to the cooling centers of a processing units, they should be able to smoothly move the milk. So if you do not have roads, you don't have a dairy system. So it's very critical. So one of the reasons why in the tribal areas where you have indigenous populations are not doing economically so well because they don't have enough communications. Of course, there are other adverse impacts of having very good communications in forest areas, because then it leads to deforestation, because you have some vested interest who try to sort of cut and transport wood out, timber out of those areas. I mean, so everything has both positive and negative aspects. So here, the other one where large-scale adverse impacts are visualized are the power sector, in whether it's not so much in coal-fired power projects, but in hydro projects where hundreds of villages might get submerged, and the whole environmental system sort of goes for a toss. And now we have so many power projects in the Himalayan terrain that it leads to a bit of the water flow gets affected, and then many communities who are living on the banks of these rivers, the water system, the Himalayan water flow system, their livelihoods are deeply impacted. And so far, solar power systems are concerned, also you need large patches of land to have those panels installed. And you need laborers to work, and then but they require a lot of water to clean these solar panels. And then it has an implication for how the local water resources sort of get diverted to these sort of industries, which would affect the consumption needs of people in states like Rajasthan, which are going very heavy on solar power. They have huge water scarcity. So, these interconnections have to be understood. Similarly, in case of industries, manufacturing, whatever, you need land, and they want these industries to be somewhere close to the ports or airports or major railway junctions so that they can transport the goods that they produce, which means this land, which may be very rich agricultural land, will be converted to industrial land where the land value will go. That's all fine. Some people will benefit, but the people who are agrarian communities, the farmers and stuff like that, who are traditional livelihoods, will be severely impacted. And then you have certain areas where there is not much adverse impact, but if you do not take into account people's views and talk to them in planning this infrastructure and social infrastructure, it will not be very, it will not meet the user needs, and the management may not be very sustainable. In case of urban expansion, it's mostly brown development, it's not greenfield, it's brownfield. So it's mostly redevelopment, it's restructuring of space. And because you have a lot of encroachments, you have the shanties and slums. These people who are in hundreds of thousands of households in different parts of the cities who are mushroomed over there, swarmed to the cities, looking for incomes, livelihoods, and they are ready to live in very miserable conditions. But even those miserable conditions get kind of disturbed. If you want to have a highway or a road, or you want to establish a factory or a big office or whatever, so they get displaced and they have nowhere to go because they have no legal rights. They have no tenancy rights. They have no the right to the land. And because they have no legal rights, they just have kind of, they're treated as tolerable. Maybe they have voting rights, but they don't have any legal rights until the last Land Acquisition Act came into picture. This talks about private land acquisition, and it offers 3-4 times, it's twice the amount of whatever is the fixed rate in urban places, and 4 times in rural areas. So definitely it made land acquisition easier, and then there were strict conditions for social assessment and consultation of people. However, it doesn't take into account what happens to people who are living in government lands. It's very silent. So whatever they give, it all depends on the specific states or specific provinces and what sort of plans and policies they have for the slum dwellers and their these settlements. So it's a little different from the legal title holders when it comes to the issue of non-title holders and how do you deal with them. And in case of services like health and education, the story is different. It's not so much about negative impacts. It's about how to plan what sort of positive impact you want to have. And there are softer issues that you need to be sensitive to. Say, for example, in case of HIV/AIDS, which was kind of very widespread in different parts of India, and the government successfully has been implementing what is called the National AIDS Control Project. Now, there's a strong stigma attached to it, and therefore people will not like to go for testing. So you have to ensure secrecy, you have to maintain the data, and you need to see to it that the counseling is proper and the patient information and the positive communities information is properly protected with the government, and they are consulted because their needs are much different. But you cannot publicly talk to them, right? So, arranging for these special consultations and interactions with the beneficiary or the target communities, and that also requires a lot of dialogue and consultation. And in case of food security, which is mostly implemented in a community-based manner in India through a range of microcredit and micro-enterprise initiatives in the rural areas, now they also have started that in suburban areas, where they have these mutual help groups where people contribute a little and then the government gives a matching grant or seed money. They use that to give it as a loan and the money is returned to the group. So they have a corpus, then they have a federation in order to support small micro enterprise activities, which do not necessarily mean to sort of fill the gap as main source of income, household income, but kind of supplemental household income. But the women get to do certain things other than sort of depending on the husbands or becoming wage laborers themselves. So that is the basic idea. This has been largely successful in India and many states, but then wherever it has succeeded not because of the government financial inputs, but because of the whole social architecture that they have been able to erect to involve people directly, because the government cannot give salary to the managers who are running these microcredit or microfinance groups. The people ultimately, after a while, will have to hire professionals to manage their accounts, take loans from the banks, return it. So that whole thing requires a very good environment of dialogue and conversation. So also in case of agricultural innovations, management of micro irrigation projects, or innovations in terms of composite farming and horticulture, all sorts of things. This whole group dynamics have to be understood, and getting people on board requires conversation, requires dialogue. Last, what is more important, I found, was emergency management. India wasn't very sensitive to this need for understanding how disasters strike people and take away decades of their involvement. Yeah, so yeah, I think there was some disturbance. I agree. So the whole question is that in emergency management, after the 1999 super cyclone and later on there was a huge earthquake in Gujarat, different states in India established what is called as disaster management authorities. And then that community involvement has a big role to play in the way you respond to these emergencies. So one of the countries which has done very well in South Asia when it comes to managing floods and cyclones is actually Bangladesh, which is not a very rich country, but in terms of community-based disaster preparedness, they are way ahead of others. And so, states like Orissa in India sort of established very good working interaction with the Emergency Management Agency of Bangladesh to learn from the NGOs in Bangladesh. And now Orissa has sort of become a very well-known state in terms of management. It's not a very rich state, it's a poor state, but then it's doing, can you hear me? Uh, okay. Yeah, so we'll go to, so you require dialogue. So we can go to the next slide, please. And yeah, so what happens is that, as I mentioned, that we have representation, but this representation is not enough. It's just once in a while, and it's very symbolic. You're just voting some people. But whether that is the real dialogue, or yeah, but that is not, it's been tested, it doesn't work in many cases. And that's one of the reasons why I have a lot of popular movements and protests against democratically elected governments. You have a very fairly strong representative system, but at the same time, you have deficit in terms of democratic dialogue between the decision makers and the intended beneficiaries. And then the interest groups who are sort of trying to be vocal and trying to convince the government that their needs must be addressed. So the lobbying takes place through the media and through different other channels to influence the government. The whole thing becomes a little more complex and challenging in a country like India, which is multi-ethnic. It's not only India, it's also in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, I have seen. I think partly also in Afghanistan. Bangladesh, I haven't worked, but even though they have one religious identity, I think largely they are multi-ethnic in terms of different cultural groups. They also have different minority groups. So when you have, India is very peculiar, you have multiple language groups, multiple social groups, multiple religious groups. And so this kind of a rainbow sort of ethnic, canvas on which you have to operate makes it very, very interesting but challenging as well. The presence of CSOs is both good, it adds interesting dimension to the whole process because they sort of have emerged as alternative players in this whole democratic arena, where even though they are not democratically elected, they are talking to people and they develop what is called moral representation or what they call discursive representation. And India law could be one of them, where you represent certain people's aspirations. You may not be democratically elected, but then you are representing a certain opinion and certain vision and certain ideological preference. And you, in that sense, have a certain moral, position from where you can articulate the argument representing those people. Yeah, I will clarify each and every acronym which is used. PAP means project affected person or people. Now the CSO means civil society organizations, and you also have corporate interests. So when it comes to any sort of stimulus, if you'd say whether it is United States or it's in India, they all lobby saying that their sector is most affected, and accordingly you have media stories because they want some concessions from the government. And so what is the challenge we are facing in our kinds of a very chaotic, cacophonic democracy? You have to ensure that the democratic process doesn't generate margins, doesn't leave out people from the process of disbursing benefits to the whole population. And at the same time, it remains sustainable, that you are not, in the name of growth, high growth, you're not compromising the interest of future generations by damaging the environment. And you are not displacing people. You are not pushing people out of their zones of comfort and survival because you want high growth, which will benefit certain other sections of people. So development is not about numbers. Development is about touching everybody's life through positive change. And at the same time, the money you have is always limited. So even if you have a wonderful moral desire to reach out to everyone and do everything that is good, and whatever is being professed by with this World Bank or this UNDP or UNICEF or WHO, they have their own vision of what should be done and they prescribe things. And every country wants to do it, but they aren't able to do it because they have limited resources, skills, and capacities. So, how do you optimally put your resources, your administrative capacity, your financial resources, your manpower, human resources? And that is a challenge. So, you have to do a lot of balancing when you are going forward in this direction. And because you have powerful private players and they are one important driver of change, if you do not assure some returns on investment, the investors are going to run away. If you talk only about dialogue or social and environment issues, if there is an atmosphere of uncertainty that if somebody is putting in money and he may not get a return, then he isn't going to go there and he'll not invest. And government doesn't have all the resources to invest and transform lives of people, which means that private players have to be taken into account. So the market economy runs on the investors' confidence, and that has to be anyway reassured. So what do you do when you have so many, mutually contradictory sometimes forces at work? And that is why dialogue is so important. So, dialogue can be both means and end in a democratic framework. As means, what does it achieve? It helps you become more time efficient, cut down the risks of delays, and put your resources for better utilization. You can ensure ownership, popular ownership of the projects that you're planning because people understand it. You have talked to them. They don't think it's imposed on them, and you can assess what are the risks in terms of the planning stage and the implementation stage, whether this project is going to roll well or not. That you can do assess. You can assess them by talking to people, by taking their views into account, by learning on the ground. A particular model of development, a particular scheme may do wonderfully well in a certain geographical or demographic setting, in a subcontinental context, in a big country like India. Same project may do wonders in South India, but may not work at all in a North Indian state like Bihar or Uttar Pradesh. That's not because they're not part of India, they don't have the same institutional framework. They have, but the local contexts are so radically different. And therefore, assessing risks is also important. And then that I already discussed about the resource allocation. What is important is that, okay, you do one project, but what next? That future planning to, upscaling whatever you are doing, expanding and sustaining, that also requires a lot of conversation with people. And that requires that you have an efficient and trustworthy feedback loop. The government doesn't just pour money into the drain, it knows where the money goes. And it needs to do those evaluations and also ensure that the social and environmental sustainability aspects are adequately cared for. And as an end, it is dialogue and conversation in a democracy are an end in themselves. Why? They foster participation. People become bigger, fuller, fitter citizens. And that adds to the depth of democracy. You can have formal electoral democracies like you have in many countries, but when it comes to whether actually people know about what's going on, there may be huge questions to be asked. There may be huge doubts being raised. So it fosters participation, and then it ensures that you have better integration of different social groups. And there is a healthy moral community called the nation, or the nation's society. Within that national borders becomes a warmer, a warmer community with a sense of fraternity because there is a wonderful dialogue going on. And that obviously helps in conflict reduction. And conflicts can happen because of many factors, but dialogue definitely sort of helps in resolving conflicts by identifying problems in advance, and recognizing concerns of different involved groups and finding ways to move out of a particular point of conflict. And then, so overall, with all this, you have huge democratic and institutional dividends. If you a society which is more conversational, where there's more dialogue, the deliberative process is more efficient, which means the institutions are more careful and they plan their things better, and the democracy functions even more efficiently. Next slide, please. Can we go to the, yeah. So, oh no, we are in the first slide of, go to the previous slide. So why is dialogue critical? I was saying is that you have to fix the gross bottlenecks. I'll just give you one or two examples. So there was this project called Mumbai Urban Transport Project funded by the World Bank, which they started implementation in the 90s. They started planning it. Implementation started sometime in 2000. But you know, it took something like 12 years to complete it, a very short project, and finally World Bank walked out of it, and the government had to complete it from its own resources. That is because the media, the NGOs, and different groups of people, they raised so many questions, and there was no interagency coordination. The planning was kind of faulty, and there was a lot of laxity in design, and there was popular protest, and the project was suspended a couple of times. If these sort of things keep happening, then you do not have timely delivery of infrastructure. And then think about the people who have invested, the contractors who come in, they don't get land, so they cannot even build anything, they walk away. Then you have to do procurement again, it takes another year. So there's a lot of, time and cost overruns. And who is losing? The citizen is losing, the taxpayers are losing. So these are so many bottlenecks to fix. And so the resistance of the project affected persons, if you don't talk to them, you don't know what sort of a solution they want, you just presume I'm going to give X and they should be happy. It doesn't work there. So, and then, and this other thing is that if you do not know what is the future need, so just imagine that you want to have a bus terminus at a particular place, and few engineers do a quick analysis and say, okay, we're going to do it for 100 buses to come every day. It's a small urban place. But actually, they haven't taken into account that few industries are coming up. There's going to be a lot of in-migration. So within just 2 years, the bus is going to run out of capacity. The bus terminus is going to run out of capacity. So they cannot do the future planning if they haven't had a good conversation amongst different investing agencies. So if they are just working in silos, they don't know who is doing what. They don't know how that urban, that sprawl is going to transform itself in the next 5-10 years. And so there's a lot of faulty planning and faulty investment. So this sort of issues can be better, addressed if you have effective dialogue mechanisms. But dialogue, when I mentioned it, just not about talking to people. It's also a dialogue between agencies, between donors. So there's a lot of need for donor coordination and need for interagency coordination, and between banks, between investors, between people, so you just need dialogue at different levels. And then you have a better decision emerging out of it. Most critical, of course, is managing the social and environmental issues. Like, for example, this expansion of the roads. The defense wants, and the forest department and certain other departments, they want the roads to be expanded in the Himalayas. And the government wants to do it. But the environmental groups think that this is going to make the Himalayan terrain even more unsustainable. This is going to be more landslides. So they are opposed to them. The Supreme Court has now put certain constraints about how much widening you can do. So you have people sort of working at cross purposes because they have their own perception of what is good for the country. And they have these perceptions, unless you have a dialogue, is never going to work out well. So you will always have people opposing each other, and you do not have an effective mechanism for addressing and achieving an optimal result. The environmental and social issues are very, very critical, as I mentioned, in specific industries. And when you have a good social license, when you have approval, there's no social opposition to a particular investment plan. You had this $6 or $7 billion investment steel project by POSCO, the South Indian company, in certain part of India, in Orissa. They were there for about 10 years, and they did maximum amount of land acquisition, but a few, a particular few villages kind of were very well organized, they opposed it. Finally, the project got dropped. But imagine the investor, they must have sort of lost millions of dollars in the process in these 10 years, which means they'll not like to invest in your country for next 10 years. They'll stay off because they'll say that it's a messy democracy. We want to be out of this place. So you have to have a democratic framework. At the same time, you have to bring in more reliability of investment. You have to ensure that the dialogue sort of happens in the right way. And so that will help in capital mobilization and sort of build investor confidence. So let's go to the next slide, please. The second, in this is another extension of this whole requirement, the rationale for dialogue is ensuring social sustainability. A lot of big projects in India, if you look at last 20 years, they have suffered because of people's opposition. So you had this car project in West Bengal, which was suspended. That Tata project, and they went to Gujarat. And then what happened? None of the other investors wanted to go and invest in West Bengal because they thought that there would be popular opposition. And the same thing has happened in other parts. We had some alumina factory in Orissa which got stuck because the tribal people, the indigenous people, were opposed to it. And many highway projects, they have started, but they take years and decades to complete, because people are kind of opposed to it. They don't want to give land. They are not happy with the compensation you give. They get displaced, they get impoverished, and that sort of hurts them. And obviously, they're going to speak out. They're going to block what we are doing. And there are different political parties and there are different NGOs who are working with them. And everybody is right from their own perspective. And that's why it makes a conversation so very important, that they need to understand each other's constraints and what each other can offer to each other for a more agreeable solution to a conflictual situation. The other thing is that you can have excellent projects, but it can just leave one half of the population, the gender inclusion issue. So, in certain projects in Afghanistan, for example, where certain ideological denomination at a particular point of time, they didn't want girls to go to school. So teachers were shot dead and schools were burnt and stuff like that. So World Bank sort of, while talking, I'm not speaking for World Bank anymore, I'm just speaking as a free individual. It might sound very funny, but in consultation with the community, they sort of agreed that they could bring classrooms with a small wall in between boys and girls. And the teacher would sit exactly in front of the wall so that he can talk to the boys and the girls, not little boys and girls, kids. But then they have a cultural situation. But this sort of a compromise, you cannot set absolute standards. And then there'll be no education. If you want to set the Western, liberal democratic standards of what the classroom should look like, then girls in Afghanistan wouldn't study. So if you want them to study, you have to have a piecemeal change and you have to agree. So this negotiation can happen if you take into account what exactly you try to achieve through your social inclusion lens. In India, for example, you have the indigenous communities. And now, of course, there is a lot of opening a bit still in certain spaces. The Dalits or the scheduled castes may face social barriers, especially in certain parts of North India. It is not so prominent in eastern parts of India or maybe in certain South Indian states, but it's definitely there in a very strong way in certain North Indian states. So you have to sort of look at it. And to ensure it, you have to have separate dialogues for these people. Because if you just do one village level consultation, these marginalized groups may not speak. I have been part of many community consultations. So if you want to do a community consultation in an eastern states like West Bengal or Orissa, you have all the women coming and they sit in front of the boys actually, or in front of the men. But if you are having a meeting in Uttar Pradesh, you have men folk coming and sitting in the front, and the women folk sitting in the back at a distant place because they have so much of gender segregation. So the story sort of varies depending on what is the social environment in which we're speaking. So you have to, if you talk to them, if you understand that, then you can address the gender gaps and exclusion risks better. On environment, then there is also a lot of misunderstanding in the sense that whenever the environmental groups demand something, the government would say that, okay, these are the environmental NGOs who are sort of foreign funded or internationally funded, and they're raising high environmental demands, and projects are suffering. So investments don't give returns. But then if you actually go to that particular area and talk to people, you'll understand that some of these environmental concerns have very, very crucial implications for the way people are going to live there. So if you have too many industries in a particular place without assessing what is the total water availability in that area, the water which is meant for household consumption is going to get diverted to the industries, and that's going to push people into some sort of a desertification and deforestation, because this could be sudden degradation of the water table, and the rivers are going to dry. All water sort of gets diverted to the industries and the tribal communities who are kind of voiceless in certain places. They are small communities, very limited number of people, so nobody cares for them in a democracy because they don't have too many votes. They are small communities, so the government could ignore them. So democracy is fine, but these people sort of do not get the kind of attention they deserve. Then and then these issues of pollution, uh, um, uh, that's also equally important. And so question of pollution and occupational health and safety, that's one critical issue in many developing countries. The contract management, there will be certain clauses with regard to labor camp management and giving safety gear to the workers. But then there's so many deaths being reported in big infrastructure projects. In fact, in shooting of films, I think a few months back, there were 4 or 5 people died because a crane fell in South India, in Chennai. So you could have that. And the particular person who was making movie is actually very, very politically and socially progressive. It happened in his case. What does that mean? That you may be enlightened, but you may not be taking, sort of not recognizing what are the environmental standards. So there are fixed environmental standards, and you are not necessarily preparing an environmental action plan while you're making a film. It's only when it's being funded by Asian Development Bank or World Bank, or it's a central project where the Central Forest Department has a role, they lay down certain fixed standards so that people will go and check. But the problem is that the taste of pudding is in eating. Everybody doesn't implement it. They produce one plan. They have a 2-page or 3-page or 20 pages saying that we have complied. But it's not about compliance. It's about ensuring that the adverse impacts are not only recognized and recorded in a plan, but actually they are addressed during implementation. So this is also very critical as to why dialogue is so important. And then, of course, with regard to the compliances, whether it's forest or pollution or traffic management, if you do not have a conversation, I know this has happened many times in big cities when you're doing urban transport. So in a big city like Mumbai, or in a case like Hyderabad, where you have very, very crowded places, if you are doing, let's say, a subway, or you are building a flyover or anything, it causes a lot of traffic bottleneck, and people's ability to commute freely is affected. So the traffic police will give you few weeks to do it. And if you cannot fix your procurement issues within that particular period, if you don't mobilize your man and material to do the civil work you plan to do, if you do not have a very good implementation management, then the whole thing goes for a toss, and the police department withdraws the traffic permission, which means you still make rounds and rounds, and then there are huge cost and time overruns. So this conversation, this exchange of ideas and concerns between implementing and regulatory agencies is equally important. And then, of course, I mean, this is like something stating the obvious about enhancing. It's not only about addressing negative impacts and reducing them, but it's also about addressing by way of improving the positive impacts. Then, and as a part of democracy, it's not that all countries are equally free when it comes to sharing information with people. But in India now, we have very high standards in terms of Right to Information Act. I mean, that I would say was a revolutionary thing, because following the RTI, there was similar legislations in US. And then also the World Bank didn't have such a open sunshine policy, but after India did it, World Bank itself had access to information policy. They came up with one, because this Indian RTI was actually a very, very radical thing. And it transformed, I mean, it put huge amount of pressure on the government agencies, and there was a lot of resistance from the officers. But then it has changed the way decisions are being made in the country. And I would say that this is a major, major achievement. And then this issue about social accountability, enabling people to sort of understand what you're doing and reaching out to them, explaining what you're doing. This is also a very key aspect of why you would like to have stronger dialogue mechanisms. This I've already stated about community ownership and participation, about managing risks. So you have many unwanted deaths due to accidents at work sites, where you have highways being constructed, or an overbridge, or a flyover, or you have suburban rail projects being implemented. Many unwanted deaths happen because people are not adequately impacted, and they are so much obsessed with their own livelihood. This is like in Bombay, they cross over the railway tracks without caring, and there are many deaths. So you sort of also have to look at that aspect, and that positively works out when people understand and participate in your projects. Emergencies I mentioned, and there is one more thing which is gaining ground, not so much in all companies, but definitely in public sector units. The government of India changed its Companies Act and made it mandatory that 2% of the profits need to be shared with people through corporate social responsibility. That sort of made it important that they need to look at not only managing adverse risks, but sharing the benefits of this investment. Just imagine that if you are living in a poor tribal area, hinterland in a state, and suddenly there's a big company comes and establishes a steel factory, and there are smaller traders and entrepreneurs that do other kind of investment around it in hotels and shops and stuff like that. They all benefit. But what happens to the indigenous people who do not have the skills to invest in malls or run businesses? They are very marginalized people. So in order to ensure that they also benefit from it, if you have acquired their land, you should return some, developed land, or you should have a revenue sharing model on a regular basis. Divert some of your profit to the local fund for local area development. So this is what broadly is called periphery development or local area development, and that also sort of is ensured. Without any dialogue mechanism, that will not be addressed as much as it can be if you have useful dialogue. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Now, what are the critical sectors and areas where dialogue is even more important? Not So if you look at mining, um, if you go to Africa and also in different parts of Asia, especially India, the tribal communities are and the indigenous people are very, very badly affected because the mining destroys the whole ecosystem, the whole environmental system there. And earlier, they could just dig and take whatever they can and then run away. And there's kind of near desertification. It's no more habitable. The local flora and fauna, everything is lost. The animals go, the birds go, and associated livelihoods go, and the people kind of become paupers. And associated with mining, you have other extractive industries like extractive and related industries. It could be about steel or other kind of industries which relate to mining, who also do huge displacements of people. And also hydro projects. The worst case in India was Narmada um, Dam, where there was a popular movement which ran for decades. And because of that movement, in fact, the benefits that was given to people in terms of compensation and alternative housing and stuff like that, it went up. Maybe they are financially better off, but in terms of their own social capital, in terms of their own socio-cultural roots, they lost all that. So that's an area where it is very important. And in the absence of an adequate system of dialogue, consultation, and benefit sharing, what happens is you have huge migration, you have destruction of the biodiversities, and adverse impacts on water and air. So you're basically making people miserable through your investment in the name of growth. Of course, the country benefits in terms of economic growth, but growth for whom and what? These are equally important questions to ask. In case of transport projects, there is a very good willingness on the part of people in rural projects. When you have rural roads projects, people want access and therefore they welcome it. But in case of highway projects, in case of urban transport projects, it's not so much about shelter which are affected, but it's actually incomes which are affected because you have small shopkeepers, traders, hawkers, vendors who are on the side of the roads, but they have no legal title and they get displaced. And and then you have a number of religious and cultural structures which sort of come up alongside roads on public land, of course, and therefore illegal. You can call them illegal, and they are illegal. But then you destroy them. Where do people go to pray? So that sort of raises a big issue. And there are a hell lot of temporary adverse impacts, like you must have seen that some people are doing highways, but unless there is very good, strong oversight, they may not be watering the road, which means there's a lot of dust and it has health hazards, poses health hazards for the local community who have to inhale a lot of dust. And other environmental issues. In terms of urban infra projects that I've seen in some of the bigger cities in India, that there is a lot of slums which are affected. And not only that, they lose their shelter. They have nowhere to go. So they are looking for some other place to encroach. They will try to go and settle in some of the slum. They may have to run from one inhabitable, miserable condition of life to another miserable condition of life. And on the issue of livelihoods and income restoration, which is perhaps the biggest challenge in case of urban infrastructure, because there's a whole lot of migration to cities because people are looking for income. But once they go and suddenly you displace them, where do they go? They not only lose their house, they lose their income. So they have nowhere to go. It's completely, they're pushed against the wall. In case of social sector, I told you that this story is completely different. It's not about addressing negative impacts, but it's about planning and implementing it in an optimal way. So you have a lot of community, primary education or health management projects, and the story varies from state to state. There are states where there are village committees monitoring the non-formal education centers and primary healthcare centers, and the outcomes of the government's investment is more fruitful than in places where there's public apathy or lack of public capacity to engage with the government, to ask questions and sort of demand better delivery. So it sort of varies from place to place. I'll discuss the Nagaland issue later on. I just mentioned it here. There's something also called disease surveillance. It didn't benefit any of us in case of Corona because it came like a tsunami. But in case of periodic pandemics in India, there are a lot of infectious diseases. The government has a system of surveillance, and they have district surveillance centers. They have epidemiologists, and now they are sort of in experimental basis in many places. They're involving NGOs and community health workers for outbreak reporting. So if there is a certain outbreak of malaria or cholera or anything, they have to look at the syndrome and immediately call up the healthcare center so that they come and study whether it's going to be an outbreak and how to sort of address it. So that works. But of course, you need to have a robust system of monitoring, but it can add a lot of value to the way you manage your public health care delivery systems. Then just imagine whether it's about the Swachh Bharat, the sanitation, or it's about corona management. A lot depends on behavior, the health-seeking behavior of people. And so if they do not change their behavior, irrespective of whatever inputs and resources you're going to put in, it's going to get you the results. So you have to help people change their behaviors. And to help people change their behaviors, you have to help them with a lot of talk, a lot of orientation and education, and you need hundreds and hundreds of community workers who want to talk to them. It's just not about TV or media. It's not about that. It's also about direct communication. But there are certain places where they're doing very well, in terms of surveillance through even cell phones. Where there were no smartphones, I've seen certain states were doing SMS-based surveillance, which was very useful. But certain other states were very bad in terms of community feedback or connectivity with the community centers. Then there's barriers to access issues, whether where do you have the public health care system? Is it next to the MLA's mother-in-law's house? Or is it actually at a place where everybody has proper access? Are all social groups allowed equal access to the healthcare system of the school, or there are marginalization setting in there? How to understand and address them if you don't talk to people, if you do not identify their concerns? So that's an important issue. The other thing is stigma. We have two kinds of stigmas that I have seen through my years in this development sector. One is the stigma imposed by society, like say corona, somebody is positive, the others are not going to go close to him. And there is a lot of self-imposed stigma. UNDP has done a couple of studies here. So there are a lot of diseases like tuberculosis in the slums in Calcutta, I have seen in many other places. Especially if it's women, it's a maid, she's working as a housemaid, she's going to different houses to work. She may have symptoms of TB. She could get free medicine from the TB hospitals or TB centers, but she doesn't go there because she doesn't want to be seen as somebody who is having tuberculosis. Because if she is known as somebody who has tuberculosis, she may not get the job of a housemaid. She may be ostracized. So she sort of stays away from benefits which are freely available to her. And that can happen in case of corona testing. It can happen in case of HIV/AIDS testing. And it's not limited to poor people. This self-imposed stigma. Society is largely responsible, but a lot to do with how the individual sort of understands what's good for him or her. So that's an area where you need a lot of consultation and dialogue and conversation with people. And this, of course, is the most critical thing in a country like India, where you have limited resources and you have a lot of people. So you have to target your deliveries, which means you have to identify the beneficiaries in a very participative and a transparent manner. Otherwise, there'll be accusations of corruption, and the trustworthiness of the project is going to take a dip. And there could be basically wastage of resources. If you so there was this newspaper in Uttarakhand where I'm right now located. The government had a special scheme to give some scholarship to the students going to madrasas, and in just about 2 months, suddenly some 200,000 students vanished from the madrasas, and a lot of people were concerned. And then there was a study as to why that happened. It is because the government said that Aadhaar cards have to be mentioned of the student, the number have to be mentioned. So, it's possible that the local elite was collecting a lot of funds, but they were just pocketing it. They actually didn't have so many students in the madrasas. The students prefer to go to normal government schools, but they would perhaps also sort of enroll in a fake way so that some money will go there. And this is not limited to madrasas. This happens in every sector in the rural areas where the oversight is weak. And therefore, if you need to do the beneficiary selection and ensure that the targeted delivery, like the tribal development plans, you have so many tribal development plans, they're only on pen and paper. They are not actually implemented on the ground. And nor do the tribal communities in extremely rural cut-off areas know what kind of schemes are being implemented in their name. So this is all in pen and paper in many places. To give you another example about these minorities, in the I think in 2015 or 16, 2014 or 15, there was a scheme which was announced to rebuild the skills of school dropouts with a special emphasis on minorities. So the Ministry of Minority Affairs, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment was doing it with some World Bank help. And when we talked to a lot of people, we said that this should be 100% targeted at women. We were just conversing that then to be able to talk to anyone, because they were targeting to do it at the madrasa dropouts and formal school dropouts, they said that if you only targeted women, you will not go anywhere. So you better take into account, and you don't say that you will exclude any particular group. You try to be liberal. But when you become liberal, actually, the better off take all the benefits. So anyway, it's a small scale being project, but there are notions about what is a skill center and what kind of job they will do, and there are restrictions, social restrictions, on what kind of income generating activities can a lady from a social background can engage in. If she's sort of living in a city, it's so much easy than in a smaller town, where the social restrictions are higher in different ethnic groups. And then I have mentioned about the livelihoods, like farmer groups, livelihood groups. They're being implemented under the National Rural Livelihood Mission, and then different states have their own specific livelihood missions, and they have their own agri programs. But agriculture isn't doing very well, except in few states where you have big farmers making benefits. But actually, in poorer states, the agriculture hasn't done much headway in a few decades. And therefore, it requires that you need to sort of talk to people about what exactly is ailing their involvement in the agricultural sector. Then on disaster risk reduction and emergency management, I have mentioned, especially cases like Odisha and Bangladesh. We can go to the next slide, please. That how it happens that there's something called, disaster risk mapping, which happens at the village level. So each village will have its own risk profile. What sort of risks are there to the survival during different seasons? A particular village in a higher, dry area may have drought risks during summer, risks of not getting water, and huge migration risks, which are slow onset in nature. Where in a state like Odisha or Andhra Pradesh or Bangladesh or Bihar, you may have a flash flood, and people may have no proper communication systems. Of course, now Odisha has built a lot of flood and cyclone shelters, but not all states have them. In case of submergence, hundreds of people not die, but they lose everything they have. So that's also an important thing. So what are the key building blocks if we want to have an effective dialogue mechanism? Where it works, how can we make it more efficient? The most important thing is to do a stakeholder analysis on any particular problem. If you're implementing a development project, you need to know who are the stakeholders and what are they thinking and what is their profile, what are their aspirations, what are their problems and concerns. And this sort of a stakeholder analysis also helps you plan your dialogue, tools and mechanisms, whatever you have in your project. So what are the key stakeholders generally you have? You have the affected groups, beneficiaries, and what I call winners and losers. There's something also some states do, what is called, it's called political economy analysis. Political economy is a word used by development agencies. I can now speak freely now that I'm a free person to refer to indirectly to corruption risks. So they call it political economy. So they'll say there are huge political economy issues. They actually want to say that the local elite is so corrupt that the local administration is hand in glove with the powerful local interests. So whatever you plan, they sort of gulp it down. So, there was a local government project being implemented, I remember, in Nepal. And then, so there was a political economy expert who was hired to go and do this stakeholder analysis. And he gave, shocking information. So what happened is that there was a new democracy, they had a new constitution. So they just said that, okay, different political parties, we haven't had a constitutional framework for elections. Can't we have an all-party committee in each local government level so that they will run the local government? Everybody said, yeah, that's a good thing to do. And then actually what it was, the same group, so it was what is called a corporal corruption, it's all together they were doing it. So the contracts, whichever money was going to different local bodies, so there's an all-party platform, right? So they decide. So you take this project, he takes that project. So they are the contractors. So if the decision maker, maybe his nephew or niece becomes a contractor, and paperwork is done and projects are implemented, but actually not much happens in the ground. So how people are concerned, they don't get much benefit. So you need to do a very useful, winners and losers. So if you are changing the policy, for example, look at the farm bills, to give an example, which is very current. Now, if you suddenly open up the markets, they are very rich farmers in Punjab and Haryana, and they don't have to pay any income tax because agricultural income in India is not taxable, and they get a lot of subsidies. So, and then they have procurements happening by the government from specific destinations called the mandis or the marketplaces, and there is a cartel which controls these marketplaces. And so you have to sell it there, and there is official price, but actually you're getting less. So MSP or minimum whatever that pay, the price, support price that the government declares, you may, if you're a poor farmer, your farm produce or whatever you have may be taken by a larger farmer or a middleman next to your village, who then collects it from different smaller farmers and then goes and sells it at that particular marketplace. And then he'll get a little less than what is the official price. And the government buys at a higher price, then it goes and it is, given it for the Manrega food for one program, and the rice goes. So this is how the whole circle is running. Now, if the government suddenly opens up that anybody can purchase, these local organized middlemen who are picking it up from the local farmers, taking it to the mandi, they get a little money. They are not very rich people, but they have depended on this particular value chain. They have a role. Now you are displacing them. And what have you done? You haven't done a proper stakeholder analysis. You haven't talked to these people. They're going to lose their middle farmers or their middlemen, but that is their livelihood right now. So if you had elaborate stakeholder consultations, you do bills where everybody's concerns are properly understood and reflected. So there'll not be so much of opposition. And then there's an adverse perception also that the corporates are now going to buy. The same middlemen will now sell it directly to the corporates, but will the corporates give the minimum support price? The government could have done a much better job if it had hired some good social analysts to do a stakeholder analysis and do community dialogues and ready the inputs required for this policy change. So unless you do an analysis of who are the winners and losers, the losers will always shout and the winners will always be happy whenever you do any policy change. So that has to be understood properly. And there's a lot of studies that was done when, say, coal mines were closed in certain parts of England or other mines were closed in parts of Europe, and their elaborate studies were done, and they did it much better job than, say, for example, what is happening in developing countries like India. Then on the issue of the next building block is having effective disclosure mechanisms. So you have to share information with people. And information is not documents because people don't understand documents. So you have to deliver information in a manner that is sort of digestible by people who can make use of that information for informed decision making. So you have to do dissemination and ways in which it raises the transparency, raises people's understanding about this whole thing, and then people should have access to it. So you can have public information centers, you can put all the documents there so that the funding agencies can come and say, oh yes, they have a wonderful public information system, but actually people may not be able to understand at all anything. And same way, you have a lot of now, because everybody has smartphone and you have, you have a huge amount of openness in terms of how the information is being shared in the media, electronic media or in social media. But the way the information is provided, still people may not be able to access it. Now, perhaps they're better off, but still, even educated people, they look at the documents which are disclosed in the government websites. They may not necessarily understand because they're written in highly technical, bureaucratic language. So you need to talk to people in a way that they understand things, and that is very important to have a meaningful dialogue. The next building block is having proper mechanisms for consultation with the adversely affected communities. And that has to be done at different stages. At the beginning, you are basically doing the scoping exercise where you are talking to people about what's going to work for them and building that rapport, and then you have the planning stage where, as per the new land acquisition and environmental EIAs, you have to have consultation, take the permission, and a hell lot of legal requirements are there in India now, where you have to disclose the social impact assessment. Then only can you notify land acquisition. You have to give them money, and then you have to also finalize the social management plan, social assessment and social management plan. These are complicated things, and many of the government departments don't even have any skills for that. So that particular, there's going to be a little time before actually the new Land Acquisition Act can be implemented in a meaningful manner. And then monitoring. So monitoring is right now top down in the sense that you have some big guy goes and asks a few questions, and you have annual, AG or whatever audits, and they comply. They write one paragraph, and the responsible government department writes 2 paragraphs, and that is what is compliance. But people still do not have much of a role. So if you can have social audit systems, they did that in case of the livelihood project called Manrega. During that, the previous government did few evaluations, and they found that there were huge gaps in the way Manrega was being implemented. And therefore, they had a lot of course corrections. I personally think there's still a lot of space for further improving whatever is being done in Manrega, because there's still a lot of leakages there. And maybe the intended beneficiary doesn't get the benefit as much as he deserves or can, with minor modifications in the way we talk to people and allow them to participate in it. And then, of course, when you have these stakeholder consultations, you have to plan that your consultations are not with all stakeholders in the same place. Because if you are farmers, then you have agricultural laborers. Just imagine in agricultural sector, the people who have land now are getting money for corona. What about the laborers? Because they're migrant workers. So they don't benefit. If you say farmers, they get excluded. Actually, they are the real farmers. They do the farming work, but they're agricultural laborers without any land. And in India, there's no system of recording leasing process. They're sharecroppers. But except for West Bengal, there's very limited states where they have done land reforms to record who is the tiller. So the land is effectively in the name of the absentee landlord. Other farmers are working. They are not legally recognized, which means even if the government has a benefit policy, they will never benefit, even though they have to benefit and do the agricultural work. So these gaps can be addressed if you have effective dialogue with people and you recognize these issues. That's another important issue, that you have to recognize tenancy, which is not recognized in many states, except perhaps only West Bengal is the state where tenancy is legally recognized. And I'm not saying that's why West Bengal's agricultural sector is very, very good, but definitely it is a little more equitable compared to other states. Then, in case of, there's something called in the social impact assessment, social management plans. EIA means environmental impact assessment. ENP means environmental management plan. These are legal requirements in India if you want to invest and do anything, whether you are a government agency, you are a public sector unit, or you are a private agency. You have to comply with these legalities. Now, there are provisions for community hearings or getting a project vetted by the people at the level of Palli Sabha, as per the 1993 Amendment Act, where there's a Gram Sabha and there's a Palli Sabha, and then there's something called Samta judgment of the Supreme Court, where it requires that environmental clearances have to be taken from people at the the lowest level, at the village level. And village is called village assembly, where people will be made to. Now, what exactly, I will discuss what exactly happens, but these are new legal requirements, which means that dialogue is not only desirable, but it's legally mandated. Whether they are being done effectively is another issue. But dialogue is not just a wishful thinking. It's a legal requirement in many areas. If you are doing a project in a sensitive biodiversity zone, in areas where the indigenous people, or and they have to actually clear it in their village assembly. If they don't, then actually nothing moves, and the forest department will not give you an environmental clearance. Then participation. So the participation, as I said, is the next level. First you consult. We are hearing people. You're saying that, okay, we have heard you, and then our job is over. But participation is taking dialogue to the next level, where the person who has talked to you is now brought in as a partner in the process of change. Okay, so he becomes a partner, and he's brought in as a participant, not as a beneficiary. So that's how he's made an equal partner in this process of change. And this works very well in community development projects. We'll look at a few success stories in the end. And then you have a lot of tools and techniques which are used for ensuring this participation at the planning stage, at the implementation stage, through monitoring. So you have something called PLA, and many of you are already in higher education. It's called People's Learning Action. And PRA is Participatory Rural Appraisal, where you are, there's something called Community Wealth Ranking. So, you are sort of using innovative, easy to understand tools and techniques to sit in villages, prepare micro plans, talk to people. And I'll just give you, by way of example, one experience where you will know that our understanding of things is far away from people's understanding of things. So in a certain part of India, in a village, we were doing a PLA, of people's learning exercise, and people were asked, who do you think is a rich man? What is the definition of a rich man? And it was an indigenous people's community, very close to a fairly big city in Orissa, and the exercise was being done there. And do you know what was the response of the people? Some of the people said, the family which has food to eat without migrating for throughout the year is a rich man. They are rich because they have food security round the clock, round the year. They don't have to migrate during off seasons when there is no agricultural activity. They don't have to run around as wage laborers, go to the mining areas or go to transport projects on the highways. They are rich people. So what we think is rich people is different. Maybe you would say somebody who is paying 100,000, maybe 500,000 income tax or something. We have certain other definitions. So what people understand by what we offer as benefit also varies. So till we have talked to people, till we have a dialogue, we are actually blindfolded. And in all our wisdom, we are actually committing development hierarchy, because that's not going to work. And we might repeat the mistake 5 times. That will not become a good decision. But that's what happens in most of the cases. So participation, that's very important. And in monitoring and evaluation, you can also have mechanisms where people can have a say in which the project is being implemented. So if there's a local officer, the local link bureaucrat, or the implementing agency is lax or non-responsive, and is not caring for the beneficiaries, and that's why the project is suffering. If you even talk to the people twice a year, it has a huge pressure on that guy, and the whole process moves much faster, much more efficiently, benefiting both the implementing agency and the people. Can we go to the next slide, please? In this particular thing, I'm basically schematically presenting how you have a multi-pronged space for dialogues. So at the top, you have the regulatory authorities and you have the funding partners. It could be government, it could be an international aid agency, it could be United Nations, it could be a corporate agency. So you have basically funding agencies and regulators. And then you have this vertical accountability of oversight, review, audit, and remedy. So they do it because they're giving you money, and they are the regulatory agencies. They'll ask you questions. They're mandated by the constitution and several of the legalities to hold you accountable for a few things. And this regulatory authorities, I also include the judiciary there. And then at the bottom, you have the downward accountability, which is to the people. So it's for delivery and outcomes and your implementation. And so you ensure your transparency in IEC, means information, education, and communication. And you do internal and external communication. So internal is what you share within the government or within the implementing agency. You may be an NGO. So just imagine you are a field office, you are doing some activities, you write a letter to another field office, that is internal communication. But if you're working with communities outside, communicating them, what would be genuine downward accountability, external communication strategies. And you have to have this, what is called grievance redress mechanisms, because if there is an error in judgment or a fault in the process of implementation, if somebody is unjustly ignored or adversely affected in the process, if you do not address his grievance, the credibility gets affected. The whole project becomes illegitimate in the eyes of the people. So you have to have, and when you have these grievance redress, in addition to that, you have the PAPs, you have the Association of Affected People, you have civil society organizations, then you have media and general public. But I would like to, at the same time, remind ourselves that when we say whether it's NGOs or media, we have to also recognize that sometimes they do represent different interests, which complicates the matter. They are not necessarily representing the universal rights and aspirations of people per se, but maybe specific interest groups. And then you have lateral accountability to other implementing partners. So if you are implementing a project, so let's imagine that it's a food security program or a livelihood project. So you're working with whom? You're working with the forest department. If it's for indigenous people, you're working with also the Ministry of Social Justice or Tribal Development. You are working with the Women and Child Development because they are women beneficiaries. You are talking to the local government people. So, you're talking to a range of lateral agencies, and you have to ensure that coordination. And that also requires a lot of dialogue skills to move the project in a smooth manner and implement it as per the timeline and delivering the benefits. And dialogue is a key linking principle connecting all stakeholders in this whole picture. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So now, so there are several roadblocks. We have building blocks, but we have a lot of roadblocks. One of the major problems in having a good dialogue process going is bad, absolutely no or inadequate stakeholder analysis. And many of the government projects actually are very weak in that. I mean, the recent Farms Bill is one example of this, that you haven't done your stakeholder analysis very usefully. And then if you do not have adequate prior information sharing and dissemination, then you have a backlash. Like, for example, the government didn't succeed. Say, for example, on the education policy, I would say the recent example, government did a little better job by taking on board different groups of people and disclosing the policy, saying that it's going to be implemented after so many years. There, so many academics were involved, NGOs were involved. There were some feedback, good, bad, ugly, whatever. But it's there for people to look at the website and respond. And then you have a technical farm policy, or suddenly it's an ordinance and there's a bill, but there's not enough conversation. So the poor quality of information sharing and stakeholder analysis, it results in a backlash. And sometimes what happens is the government wants to avoid a conversation because it sort of is a high risk perception. It thinks if people know, then there's going to be a lot of problem. Okay? And so they kind of stonewall the communities. And sometimes the people themselves may be very apathetic. And in case of high risk perception, you can have an issue where the government sort of overreacts, And there was this incident of shooting at some tribal people in Orissa, I think in 2007 or 9. So there were some 20, 30 people for a Tata project that were killed because they were land acquisition, they had been paid some compensation, but they went back to recapture their land, and the young police officer ordered firing, so 10 people died, because he thought his life is under threat. But the problem is that this was overreaction. So he did not present a good picture to the chief secretary, who is sitting at the capital of the state. And then he says, you think you're threatened? Okay, try to protect yourself. And he starts firing and he kills. So this is, and then sometimes there's a systemic pushback when people ask questions. Okay, the systemic pushback also can be from a lot of old-time bureaucrats who are not ready to talk to people. If you go to them, they'll say, no, we don't want to do that. People are asked kinds of funny questions. What do they know about it? It's such a technical thing. We have a lot of professors involved. We have a very good design project. End of the day, the project fails because you don't talk to people. Then if you talk to people, that is another funny thing I have seen, that when you talk to people, the local elite kind of gets organized. It knows the government needs local support. It tries to hijack the whole dialogue. So the vocal members of the community and the local elite sort of dominate the public consultations, which are organized with their blessings. So the actually marginalized tribal people or women or old, they don't manage to speak because you have these powerful local sharks who are kind of trying to hijack the whole project. And they do. And the government takes their help, and the project There is no effective change. There is no meaningful course correction in the project because they can legally say that they have local buy-in. But actually, this local buy-in is buy-in of the local elite. So that particular distinction isn't made. So if you have good team workers who know what dialogue is and how it works and how the interest groups can pollute or sort of adversely mess up an otherwise well-intended public consultation process, this will not work. So you have to be sensitive to that issue. And that will happen if you have done a good stakeholder analysis, identified the winners and losers, who are the powerful local interests, who might try to block the whole thing or try to hijack it. These things sometimes have to be done at the pre-planning stage through a social assessment, or a political economic assessment. Then, as I was mentioning, that the local administration I've seen is very soft on the powerful interests. It will rather be strict with the weaker, demographically large, but weaker sections. They will apply the laws very strictly, but be a little soft on very powerful interests. So that's also a very bad thing. And then the CSOs, or what they call GONGOs. GONGOs is government organized NGOs. A lot of NGOs which are government organized. They want to be a little more flexible. So you will have a government officer heading it, but legally it's an NGO. And then you have DONGOs, which are donor organized. So it could be organized by one funding agency from abroad or from inside India, and they have an NGO. And that NGO, even though it's a locally based organization, it's essentially a social contractor. It blindly implements what the donor wants. It's donor driven. So it doesn't have a voice of its own, even though it's a so-called civil society organization. It also happens with what is called bongos. Now, a lot of corporate agencies have their own CSR foundations, and they have their own NGOs who work. So they are not involving community groups, or they are not involving professional NGOs who are more transparent, more accountable. But they will have their own agency. Why should I spend money on you? I'll have my own outfit. And a lot of people do that. So there is actually limited meaningful freedom in the manner they participate, because they are representing their donors, whosoever it is. Then, another roadblock is the quality of managers you have. Okay, so these managers, I was talking to once I was coming from Nepal, and the president of a particular, power company was sitting next to me. We were having a conversation. I said, "What's the major problem we face in land acquisition and social environment issues?" He said, "The major challenge is not people; it's my engineers." I said, "How?" He said, "They are trying to over-impress me by pushing through the whole thing, because I need to know that I'm outsider, I'm investing in Nepal, and therefore I need to have my business which is sustainable." But these local engineers who belong to Nepal, they think they don't need to do this and they can give this much and people is happy, but I'm ready to spend about 5% of my total financial outlay for these handling issues of social environmental management. But they would like to do it at 1%, but they think I'll be impressed. But then in this process, they create problems for my future sustainability. So, these local managers who do not have proper communication skills, they do not have proper facilitation skills in holding the dialogues with people, they damage their own business interests more by hurrying through this. Then, and then you have a lot of ideological play where you have different political groups. So one political party, which may be asking for one particular policy, when it is out of power, they might oppose it. So that happens all over the world. And then when it comes to people, I've seen that I have gone for public consultations, and we'll be running around asking people, please come, please come. They'll say, yeah, but no, I'm in my shop, I cannot leave it. So wait for my son to come, then I'll come. And after 2 hours, if you're waiting, they'll come and they'll say, just wind it up in 30 minutes. No, we trust government. Fine, the road is fine. That's not a problem. But when the road construction starts and their shops start getting demolished, then they start shouting, say that we were not consulted. This thing hadn't happened. But if you look at the government records, they have tried to do. So, the public apathy sometimes, because they do not understand the importance of dialogue and how they could use this to protect their own interest in a meaningful way, is also responsible sometimes for these dialogue processes becoming less fruitful. And so then in certain specific cases, you could have, the religious or ethnic identities, which might affect the way the dialogue happens. So if you have diametrically opposite ethnic groups at a particular point, you have to meaningfully organize your dialogues. Otherwise, it could, result at a community level conflict or difference on a particular set of issues. And as I've already mentioned about the restrictive social settings, this especially I'm talking about women, but it can vary. So I had once was doing a consultation in Kashmir after the floods, and I said, so I went, but all women were freely talking. And then I was talking to an officer. He said that I said you should have separate consultation for your women here because women don't come out. And he got very put off with me, and he said that don't confuse Kashmir with Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, because we are very advanced and our women literacy level is as good as male literacy, and it's somewhere around 74-80%. So you don't confuse us with Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, and they have special pride because their women there enjoy much more freedom. Maybe it's got a little curtailed over the last 1 or 2 decades, but when you look at the literacy rates and results in education and other things, there is not much of a gender gap there. So the Human Development Index is pretty good. So, this social segregation or the social restrictions has nothing to do with faith per se. It has a lot to do with other geographical factors and other sociocultural factors, and you have to carefully wade through this whole cobweb. Then sometimes what happens is that you give false information because you want a quick approval. So you tell lies to people. You promise big things, and what happens is that when actually the project document arrives, none of the things you had promised are there. But the lower level officer who had gone, people said, okay, you are doing this. Can you do a small school here and a park here? He says, yes, it will be done. You sign for the highway. So people sign for the highway. And then what happens? The contractor comes and he doesn't build the park. They said, you build the park. He says, why? It's not part of my contract. And then that officer has got transferred. So people block that road construction because they think that is part of peripheral development. This road contractor is going to build a park for them or going to build a mosque or a temple for them. But that is not part of the contract because the lower level officer, in his great enthusiasm to get a quick approval of the social management plan, he told lies to people. He made false promises. What happens? It raises a lot of suspicions regarding your own credibility. So there is a lot of public mistrust. And then with people, I have also seen that they're kind of not fully aware of what's going to happen, and their expectations keep changing. So the whole thing is a little uncertain, and this changing need perception, they might agree with you, say this, and then somebody comes, misleads them, and promises that we'll do something else. Don't join that project. They might question you because they're vulnerable. They don't have enough access to information. So that can also that can also be a roadblock for the dialogue process. Sometimes the communities can be very highly organized, especially in urban places, and can do very hard bargaining. Then in the process, what happens is the investor may just run away, or the government may actually drop that project. So they were a road project, imagine, in an urban area, and you asked for the moon when it comes to compensation or business opportunities and job and other things you ask, and the government runs away, so drops it, and changes the alignment. Then what happens? You continue to live in the slums. You didn't have the road, and maybe people just about 50, 100 meters away from you will get all the benefits. Then you can have heartburn, then you're gone, because the road has gone away from where you live. So this can also happen, and then then in future when you want to do something else, the people may have apathy towards you. So these are some of the things. And what is most critical is that we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So so there are certain don'ts and do's that you have to keep in mind, what is relevant and what's not. One thing is that you have to do honest and fuller information sharing with the stakeholders. Don't hold back, don't lie, because you have to enable them to share their informed views. And then they more authentically come and join a dialogue with you. If you say that, does the design include a swimming pool? You say, yeah, well, it's a health problem. It will not have a swimming pool. But they think, okay, but maybe, they are innocent village people. They think you're going to give them a swimming pool for them. And they ask you, say yes. You have not given them proper information. Or you might say that there could be a 50-50 community partnership health project. So the community has to, so I'll just wind up another 10 minutes, another 10 minutes exactly. So I'll wind up. So, that's one issue. The other one is that you have to respect, trust, and support your stakeholders. First thing is that you have to respect. You don't say that these people are trying to trouble you and stuff like that. Then dialogue doesn't happen. Dialogue is essentially heavily reliant on mutual trust and respect. And then you have to understand, what are the strengths and weaknesses of whatever dialogue you're offering. Dialogue in itself doesn't solve any problem. It's essentially a mechanism, a process to reach decisions which are going to be helpful or not. So you have to recognize what methods you're doing, how much time or money you have, what are the limitations of the process. So, people might get overexcited, but you have to remain sort of grounded and tell them exactly what you're offering and what they need to understand that they're getting, and what they need to contribute. And all the time, that sensitivity to socio-cultural norms of people is very, very important. Like, for example, you cannot smoke, or you cannot go shake hands with women in a rural area, or directly talk to them, or ask personal questions, which will not be taken kindly. So you have to look at those sensitivity issues. And most important is that documenting and disclosing the consultation minutes is very, very important, because you might have a wonderful conversation. If you don't document it, it's lost. People might say, no, they haven't been told this. So you have to not only document, but you have to disclose. Is it a religious dialogue, or it is a social dialogue, or it's for business or development? But dialogue and documentation, they sort of go together. And then don't expect a consensus, that dialogue will solve problems. But starting the process of dialogue is very important, because that's going to create mutual goodwill and bring people together. Slowly, there could be higher synergy in course of the discussion. And then this trustworthy grievance. Now, can we go to the next slide? I think that's the last slide. So I was just mentioning some success stories, few. So, one thing I found was very effective was the relocation of religious structures in Bombay and several other highway, state highway projects. I found that people were extremely cooperative, and the government gave something. So whether it is a mosque or not mazars are hard to dislocate, but mosques and churches and temples, I've seen people not only dislocate, but they relocate and make it much bigger. So they ask for certain compensation, you give them a piece of land, give them a little support. Generally, I have seen they build a much bigger temple or mosque. And in Bombay, they have built beautiful mosques and one church also. On their own, government gave them only 1,000 rupees per square feet and gave them land, of course, free of cost, but they had beautiful structures coming up. And in rural roads, that's one good thing, that they have something called local road users committee. It's a very good, wonderful, experiment where the land acquisition, the local people had a big role to play. I found in the Nepal rural roads project, that was a positive thing. And that's because in the community life in Nepal is very rich. And then the rural water sanitation scheme. groups in especially the hill areas where they don't have this piped water supply. They have to tap the stream water, and they will have to have water storage and local water supply. And that works wonderfully well in Himachal and Uttarakhand and certain other places where women actually manage it. It's called user groups, and they have their own technicians and all. Disaster management, Bangladesh and Orissa, very good experiments. Social forest management in many places, but mostly again Himachal, Uttarakhand, I think certain other states. And Northeast, they do wonderful also, the community management. And urban resettlement, there is one great story called Magarpata, it's close to Pune, where the project affected people themselves came together to resettle themselves and came up with a township, which was very, very useful, very nice. In you said some students are from Sri Lanka. I would like to tell that they have done a very good resettlement project in Colombo. I worked on the Metro Colombo project there for a while, and I found that even though they don't have a very strong, vibrant democracy, it's not so, the press is not so free like it is in India. But, in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, what I found is that there is very rich social capital. So, and the government is largely respectful of people's concerns. So, they are much more efficient. You just have to recognize that they are just much more efficient. And so they have done a very good, urban resettlement, good dialogue with people. And Mumbai in India, urban resettlement. In social housing, you have the Kutumbashree in Kerala, where people's participation dialogue is very meaningful. And after the Filing cyclone and Orissa, the social housing project was completely implemented by the people, no contractors. And they have done a wonderful job. They hired their own contractor and they did it. And so they built thousands of houses, which was a very useful thing for dialogue. Community health, I would say, perhaps Nagaland is a very unique example where the government gives funds to the community, and the community will have to run its own private healthcare center. And that's because they have a very, very strong community life over there. And livelihood projects, of course, all over the country. The success rate varies from state to state. So let's go to the next slide, please. Just next 5 minutes, I'll finish it. Yeah. So what are the positive factors where dialogue becomes actually meaningful? Wherever you have social capital, both bonding and bridging, and I think Bezard was mentioning that this communal issue is better addressed in areas where different communities live together. And the best example, in fact, is Dharavi slums in Bombay, where in 1992 there was communal rights. But that slum where Hindus, Muslims, Christians all live, not a single incident took place. And I personally have been to that place several times to study it. There are several manufacturing groups, and they do a lot of export, leather goods. But if you go, they have one common place where they have Durga Puja, they have Eid, they have Muharram, they have everything. And they have own community level conflict resolution mechanisms. So there will be no eve teaching or incidents or rape or anything or gender-based violence. It's not reported so much in therapy because the community leaders are very powerful and they solve it and they respect each other. I call it shared privacy. It's like an extended family. So they're just living like a big extended family where everyone knows everyone. So, so that's wonderful. So this is high social capital. So dialogue becomes easier. Presence of competent NGOs. You can have a lot of NGOs, but NGOs may not have any competence to do proper dialogue processes. So you need NGOs. So, this India Dialogue Foundation, for example, it's not about just having talks and all, but you perhaps in future could do, and all of you students can become trainers so that you can do training to other NGOs as professionals, give them some tips on how to do dialogues, because this process has to be taken forward. It's important to have limited political interference, because if you have too much of political interference, then success is less. And how open is the administrative staff? If they have people who have done a few participative projects, they have confidence, they can go and talk to people. You have new entrants who are scared of people, they stonewall and they avoid people. So there is a failure of the dialogue process. So previous experience is important, and absence or limited ideological posturing helps. If you have too much of ideological posturing by either NGOs or the people or the government, then dialogue doesn't work. And then it requires a lot of persistent, sustained efforts. It doesn't happen in a day. And then if you have a few champions, If you have the political leaders, the chief minister, for example, or maybe the prime minister, or maybe the state, the judiciary, or the heads of the departments, they are open to the idea of dialogue, then I have seen that it is much more easy to have that on the ground. So it's so much about leadership as well, and media. Media properly upfront develop, reports something, then the government is much more under pressure. And transparency and honest engagement in the grievance redress mechanism. So broadly, this and demonstration. The last point is important. You talk to people and you have dialogue, and they give some inputs. Then you should at least have one or two changes in the design, and you demonstrate how you have respected their opinion. Then that goes a long way in building, people's ownership and their confidence level. And the next one is again, just for your education. The next slide we can go there, please. The next one is again a schematic. This is called demand. Demand side. For good governance. So there's a supply side, which is giving good delivery and so on, but there's a demand side, and the demand side is about how to do the monitoring and promoting, mediating, and responding good governance. So if you look at it, I've just mentioned it schematically for one resettlement project. So you do community-based monitoring, involve local committees, user groups. That's about monitoring, which is the demand side of the same monitoring, which is done vertically, which is the supply side. Similarly, promoting information disclosure, Socio-Motor disclosure policy, and documents and beneficiary lists and all the things. That by doing this, you're telling people this project is there for you. So you promote people to ask for benefits that they deserve. So you encourage people to ask questions. So there is less leakage. And mediation is about particularly this dialogue that we are having, and that I've already discussed. So I'm just recorded it for you to study, and then the response is that when you have done all that, you should have some ways in which you respond to people by changing the policy, by having more robust, implementation mechanisms, and actually ensuring social inclusion and minimizing gender gaps. And let me stop here. And we have still 1 hour for you to ask questions, and I'll invite questions.
Thank you, Swamiji, so much for your presentation. Now, if you have any questions, comments, please raise your hand or drop me a message on WhatsApp. Right. Swamiji, do I end this talk?
Yes.
Screen sharing?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So Sabiha More wants to go first. Sabiha More, please.
Any questions here?
Sabiha ma'am, your microphone is muted. Please unmute it.
Sorry. Good evening, Swamiji. My name is Sabiha More, and I'm a teacher educator based in Mumbai. And we have a college named as Gandhi Shikshan Bhavan. And we have a lot of exercises, I would say. I would never say we profess or practice, because professing Gandhi's life is a hard task. You cannot profess what he said. But we try to have a lot of exercises on dialogue, peace, and reconciliation, so that the world becomes a bit better place to stay. That is what we make our student teachers understand. We had a lot of national seminars which were based on a lot of displaced people, and once we had a tribal seminar in which Medha Tai had come to our college. My whole observation is, it's not a question, rather it's an observation that dialogues fail, especially in a democracy, or rather in any form of polity, and it fails miserably. Just to give you two examples, one is the closure of all the cotton mills in Mumbai, Datta Samant Union, when they were doing dialogue with the developmental authority, that is Bombay MMRD. They failed to have a meaningful dialogue, and all the mills came to an end. They all stopped, and people were thrown in abject poverty I don't know whether there was a study done which says that there is a direct correlation between closing of the mills and rising of the gangism in Mumbai. The local gangs were raised very badly because in 1981, Datta Samant took the leadership of having a dialogue and it failed miserably. And then there was a lot of gang wars in Mumbai, whether it was Chota Shakil or Daud or anything. There is a study being done. But I was astonished to know that Datta Samant built a bungalow in Powai and he was living a very lovely life, though the dialogue failed, but he gained. So that is one part of looking at dialogue. And the second, I would like to quote the example of Vedanta in Orissa, in which the mining authorities were given the entire project of, and the Santali people were displaced. Till date, they are displaced. They don't know what to do with their lives, how they are going to reconfirm their life in an urban or semi-urban area. And there also the dialogue failed. There the polity failed people, and in Mumbai, individual failed people. So my whole question is, why is in dialogue greed a very important factor? Why does greed come in? What is the problem? Whether it is Vedanta, whether it is Datta Samant, whether it is anybody else, dialogues fail, and it fails everywhere. It fails in Azerbaijan, it fails in Belarus, it fails in Mali, it fails in Russia, it fails everywhere because of the personal greed. And I don't know why. Why does it happen? I want to know what is it that stops a meaningful dialogue to take place so that everybody has got a win-win situation. Thank you very much, Swamiji.
Okay, actually, I'm so happy to talk to you because my a bit of my heart is still in Mumbai because I was posted actually when I joined the bank. They sent me directly to the Mumbai project because they saw there was a huge problem over there in the Santa Cruz Chembur Link Road. And, actually, I was supposed to make a presentation only on the Mumbai project today, but I thought I'll make a general talk before you give a specific case study. It's not that dialogues always fail. I was telling you that I'll give you 3-4 personal life experiences. So one is that there were 2 villages in Orissa. I was telling Behzad about it, and they did not talk to each other for 30 years. And that's because the heads of these 2 villages had become enemies to each other. And so there was super cyclone. They were all affected. Hundreds of lives were lost in both the villages. And then there was one, and they were mostly, Khandayat, or what you call like Maratha villages, agrarian, partly Kshatriya, partly agrarian, whatever, dominated villages. And suddenly then there was one Kayeth family who were, into service sector, but there's just one family. They were having a bit of land, but they were educated in small family. And they were marginalized. They never opened their mouths because they were bitten up, whatever. They are powerful 2 villages. So after the super cyclone, the NGO which went there, it says that we don't give any benefits to individuals. We give benefits only if you have a village committee. And then you have this village committee having 30 to 40% women. And this committee will have to also have one Dalit representative. And if there's a minority group, it has to have a Muslim representative. That is the condition for us to engage with any village. So first they didn't want to do it, but they came around and they formed village committees. But then the NGO said that, well, there are 2 small villages. We cannot have 2 separate village committees for this. The best way to deal with it is that you have one committee. So this isolated Kailash family was slightly educated. They volunteered to give a feast for both the villages. Anyway, people were hungry and they were slightly better off. And they said that let's do a bhajan kind of thing, a collective prayer, because we have lost a lot of people. They came together. And then when I went there, that particular night was the feast. They were very happy because the children were friends in the school. They were talking to each other. Once they will enter the village, they'll not talk to each other. The girls will be talking to each other in the school. It's a highly illiterate village. Literacy was about 80-90% in that village, in both the villages. So that night they were celebrating and they were so happy they were realizing what they had missed in 30 years. So I do not think that human beings are by nature nasty, brutish, and short like Thomas Hobbes believed. I believe that actually we are of pure spiritual nature. But then there is ignorance of regarding our own nature. And so we are more obsessed with our limited manifestation. We don't look within and look at the possibilities. It just takes a little critical thinking to step back from where egoistically you think we were there. And just look at Gandhi. And Gandhi was not stupid. He was very, very wise. He forced the British because he thought that I have to, that on 2nd of October, we actually had a good meeting on the Gandhi story. You know, Gandhi was trying to take non-violence to the next level, where for him it's a spiritual experiment where you are forcing your opponent. So it was politics without an adversary. Okay, and it's very important for us in India today. So politics means taking a decision as to who's your enemy with whom you want to fight. But Gandhi said, I am doing a politics because he never treated the British as the enemy. He still would like to do ambulance service during the wars. He treated them as brothers. And Toynbee has written that famous essay, I remember, he gave them an opportunity to escape with a sense of dignity and then re-establish relationship with India. So what I'm saying is that that story you mentioned about the failure of dialogue and Datta Samanta is rich. I'm not taking names. I know another 4 or 5 powerful NGO leaders in Bombay who normally go to Taj and try them to dine. And you know them, right? They would be there. And environmental activists who extract benefits from builders by saying that I'm going to block your project. And they get a couple of flats. And these are there everywhere. You have sharks behaving like saints. I mean, that's fine. But that doesn't mean dialogue per se is not workable. And Bombay, in Mumbai, you must be knowing there's a place called that, Netaji Nagar. This is just after BKC, if you take a left turn, after Buddha Nagar. So you have the, so Hajipur, and you have that particular place. Which is called the Netaji Nagar, where you have a lot of old car parts being sold, and there's a lot of factories. It's primarily a Muslim area, and then there is a couple of factories which are owned by other people. And there was a big fight between the government and these people, and it went on and on and on. But you'd be surprised that this was resolved. And I want to actually, that's a special case study. So they turned around, and there was a lot of opposition. The government put one of their leaders in the jail under some pretext, but end of the day, there was a dialogue which was started. And I was advised when I went there not to even dare there, because somebody said that's a Daud area, don't even go there. But I went and chatted with people, and believe me, they turn out to be wonderful friends. And when I go to Bombay, if they meet me, they'll come and talk to me, and they're nice guys. There's not a problem. You think they're criminals. They're actually nice guys. So the mill story, I don't know. There's one Australian who's done a good story on the Bombay, or the in parts of Bombay. Bombay is a very complex story. And there's a lot of, I think if you are in touch with this Arjun Apodari's, there is this NGO Pukar, right? They do a lot of research on that. Pukar has done a lot of work on different aspects. So just imagine we had some of the powerful NGO leaders involved in the Mumbai Open Transport Project. One was Sheila Patel's Spark, and then the other one was Joachim, who was a Maxis Award winner. So he was also part of it, and Mahila Milan was part of it. And so they were all working. But end of the day, what actually happened? They didn't have control over their, their ground level NGO workers. And so there were a lot of allegations about what the NGO workers were kind of telling people, we are giving them house. So the government was giving them free house. The NGO was an intermediary, So there was a lot of things that like stories came up. And later on, there was another NGO, you know about that, Pragla, again, a very good NGO, but their field staff, they were arrested because of a corruption allegation. So you can have these dark shades, but doesn't mean dialogue doesn't work. Because in Mumbai, if you go to Amarmal Junction at that particular point, I have talked to that group. So there was a temple, there was a small prayer hall with Christians, there were two temples and a mosque, very close to each other. And the government was saying, I'll give a common plot of land and we look at all these three structures. And the leader of the Muslim community, who was actually working with Reliance, a very qualified engineer, he said, no, we are brothers. We have been here for 50, 100 years, but India is changing. And there are a lot of problems. And then in future, if there's a communal right, I don't know. So why you are forcing all of them into one building? Because their requirements are different. Give us a slight relocation point and we'll do it. But they were all together in each meeting, was done with all of them. But if you go there, at Ammamal Junction, you will find a beautiful mosque has come. People are opposed, they themselves relocated, and two beautiful temples have come. So, I wouldn't say that dialogue doesn't work. Same way, you have 20 Mahada buildings on that STLR road, and they are middle-class people. They were completely doing a pushback, and government of MMRDA finally agreed after a lot of pushback from the World Bank to relocate and rebuild their houses. And they got 50% extra built-up area in the new houses. So they were given rent for 4 years so that they can move off and the road can be constructed. So, but the mill thing is bigger because there are private players there. The mills are owned by, they wanted their land and they wanted to close it. And just look at the cess buildings. Why government is not changing the Mumbai Rent Act? And there are hundreds of owners, why they don't resolve it? Because some very powerful people are living in these cess buildings under the Rent Control Act. The real owners want to lose the. So Bombay is a very, very complex area. And I agree with you that it's not only there. In Orissa, the POSCO got cancelled, and some of the social leaders, that's what I was saying, they make a career out of it. Everybody is not Medha Pataka, by the way. Medha Pataka is unique. I know her. I have high regard for her. And I think her father was also a trade union leader. And I think somebody was, one IS officer who taught her, who was telling this to me, was from, I'm not taking his name, but everybody is not Medha Pataka. There are a lot of activists and so-called people who are representing the poorer people. They benefit. They have international careers and they become stars. And the people actually miss out on some benefits. That has happened in some projects. By the way, the Vedanta project, the Santal, I know the NGO, which was, and the firing which happened in Rayagada. The head of that NGO is a personal friend of mine. But actually Vedanta has walked away because it didn't get the lease that it required to be sustainable. So it has walked away. The factory has closed. It's actually everybody's a loser. That's what you said is very important. When dialogue fails, everybody is a loser. So in Orissa, Vedanta is a loser, government is a loser, people are a loser because they did not plan. They thought they could rush it through. They could impress people with some quick fix solutions which do not work. So you need to have honest conversation. It might look like a very costly affair to start with, but by having the dialogue, you're actually cutting down on long-term costs of the project. That's what has convinced me. And if you are honest, if they are not political or ideological adversaries, if there is, just imagine that you want to have a factory, okay? And then maybe there's an international corporate who is your competitor, who is pumping money into NGO to make that your project fails. That can also happen. That's also happening. So what can you do? We are living in a very complex time. So we have to live with it. But I personally think that we should not lose hope that greed is an essential element in our character. No, I don't think so, because all of us know we are going to die. We cannot carry greed too far away. It's going to be here for some time. But imagine all of us know that's for sure. Greed is useless, isn't it? It cannot take us anywhere. We know it. But yeah, but I don't think it's our essential self. This is our ignorant self, and the reason why you should open up to the higher truth is actually to get rid of this ignorance. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Swamiji. That was indeed very, very elaborate of you to explain. Yes, I don't know.
We can have an offline conversation when I come to
thank
Bombay,
you.
or you can talk to me. I'd love to talk to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Right. Anyone else? Does anybody else want to ask a question? No?
Actually, the presentation was so long, they all got tired.
Okay, Abul Kalam Azad, I think, wants to ask a question. Yes,
Okay,
please go ahead.
Yes, sir.
From Bangladesh.
Yeah,
sir. Please tell me about yourself a little.
Sir, my name is Abul Kalam Azad. I am from Bangladesh.
Uh-huh.
Sir, in your presentation, many part was regarding dialogue. I want to ask you a question regarding the leadership. The importance of leadership while conducting the dialogue. If you knows how to conduct the dialogue.
Could you repeat the question, please? There was a weaker sound link.
I'm saying that the relationship between the leadership and the dialogue. Let's say if you have the quality of conducting a dialogue.
Bezat, can you hear him?
Can you hear me?
I'm not being able to hear.
Swamiji,
hello? Can you repeat it?
Okay, repeat once more.
Can you hear me? Am I audible? Hello.
Swamiji, can you hear us? Hello? I think there is some problem with his internet.
Okay.
Okay, let's wait for 2 minutes. I think
Can you repeat the question? I have come back. There was
yes.
There was a blackout, but I have come back. Can you ask the question again? Can you ask his question?
My question is regarding the relationship between the leadership quality and conducting a dialogue.
Yeah, Abdul, please ask your question.
Sir, can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question is, let's say in your presentation, many part was regarding, development with different kind of people. Let's say whenever you are going to conducting dialogue with different type of people, you should have a leadership quality also. So, I am asking about the importance of leadership quality while conducting the dialogue.
Yeah. Yes, it's very important. But actually, I told you that dialogue succeeds when you have leadership support for participation from above. So in Bangladesh, for example, the emergency management is successful in ensuring people's participation because the government realized that it cannot solve all problems of people itself. People have to be aware, they have to be alert, and they have to respond to cyclone warning and flood warning. So over the years, even though I have talked to the Bangladesh team who had come to India, the relief department team, even though they give about 1/5 of what government of India gives in case of a cyclone or it, they are much more successful. Why? Because it's, this leadership kind of blossoms with experience. But you need political leadership, administrative leadership, to give confidence to the ground level officers to display that leadership. And you are very right that leadership is an important element, but it doesn't blossom in a day. You have to give confidence to your officers. You have to do training, what they should mention, what they can promise, and what they cannot promise, because their hands are tied. So dialogue requires a lot of training. It requires a lot of facilitation skills. And this consultation, it's in BRAC University, they do a lot of training in actually community consultation and dialogue. And there are several NGOs who do very good job in Bangladesh.
Thank you, sir. I'm also from BRAC University.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Right. Anybody else?
Hi, everyone. I have one small question. So,
Please
yes,
introduce yourself. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Nitya, and I'm a student of psychology. Yeah. So
Where are
thank you for your lecture. So my question was that, when, especially in a democracy, when we don't find that dialogue has been incorporated as a value or as a democratic ethos, and we see that when the government, when especially the executive, the representatives of the government have been violating dialogue, they are supposed to set a precedent, a sort of a model. But when we see continuous monologue, so there have been so many human right violations. And when we see, you also spoke about the accountability. When the government refuses to take that accountability by negating the dialogue, by violating free speech, then how do civil society create this consciousness around the value? But otherwise, at institutional level, the civil society using social media, people have been promoting this idea of engaging in the dialogue. But when the people in authority, and being a democracy, there is no space where they can be questioned, or they totally refuse to talk on such serious issues that has been ongoing in the country, then how do we really internalize this value when there has been so much of violation for the dialogue per se? So yeah, I would just like to have an answer to this question, that how as civilians uh, we uphold this value of dialogue when we see a constant violation of it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you have articulated in a very emotional manner. You are a student of psychology. I'm sure you have read about Carl Jung, and you have read about the shadows in our personality. And but if you want to start a conversation, because you are a student of psychology, so if you think the other person is completely not open to you, so you tell me what are the skills you have to employ, what do you do? So that's what I'm saying, that I have seen that just a simple conversation, because once you have a certain perception about what I'm going to tell you, you will definitely project those fears and anxieties into the conversation, which will also evoke more anxieties and negativities from my side. But what we have to do a Gandhi to ourselves somewhere. And because you are professionally trained in psychology, we have to sort of isolate our initiative to work towards dialogue by dissociating it from our perceived traumas and anxieties and shadows, because we are also not free from our own shadows and ideological predilections. So I personally do not believe that there is anything called government. Government is not a personality. I've worked at different levels with the government, and I found that it's a very if it's a personality, it's a completely split personality. It has a multiple personality disorder if you look at the government. So it has different viewpoints working, and different people work with each other. One person might stonewall you, and then he get transferred. The other one might be extra eager to finish it off, the dialogue. So I have seen that, and what I have learned is that irrespective of what could appear as a kind of a resistance or a negative energy, just a conversation helps. Just a conversation. Just, you don't have to do anything, but just have a cup of tea. And that's what we did in Mumbai. I'm telling you, they were so powerfully organized. So just you see, I mean, the person with whom you want to have a conversation, you have a lot of problem, I would suggest don't discuss the issue. Just have a cup of tea. Just go out. Don't discuss the problem at all, because that is going to create a quarrel. Don't discuss it. Just sit together, have a cup of tea. After two, three cups of tea, you'll slowly start warming up. And so far government is concerned, sometimes adversarial relationship leads to a better relationship. Okay, so in Indonesia there was a case study that there was this NGOs in the government, there was a huge conflictual attitude at a particular point of time, and it has happened in other parts of India. So after the Vedanta in Orissa, the NGOs, the government wanted to control the NGOs. It brought up a bill to control them. There was a lot of pushback from NGOs. Then what happened is that within 2 years in Orissa, the government has NGO coordination cells in most of the departments. So sometimes a quarrel is very useful, because conflict and cooperations are two wheels on which the society moves. You have studied psychology, and we have to accept it. A quarrel is an essential part of a loving relationship, because if there are some unaddressed questions and there are pent-up emotions and frustrations, good to have a fight, because you're releasing them. And then what happens? Then you talk, and then you make a turnaround. Of course, you can have a terminal sickness coming into the relationship, but in my experience, I've seen that whosoever, we require patience on both the sides. There is oversensitivity. We have got very, very polarized in all spheres, and there is so much of insensitivity. The only way to survive is not to listen to TV and radio or WhatsApp and Twitter. You just have to keep yourself away from all this for some time. So I think we need not lose hope. Do you think the government at any point of time is less friendly than what Mahatma Gandhi had to deal with? No, they were kept for decades in the jails, right? So we are just becoming impatient. We just have to have enough patience with us. And you should be actually telling me that let's be more patient, because you are trained in psychology. And that's the area, We understand that human mind is a fluctuating thing. It's a processual thing. And then if you read a bit of Buddhism, you're a student of psychology. If you read a bit of Yogacara, or read, especially I personally think the Yogacara, if you read, you will find that he's saying there is no self. It's only mental processes. When you do this, that happens. So there is nothing, no value adjustments. You change these conditions of your thought process, these thoughts change. So, but I'm not simplifying it. I'm always saying is we need to take a deep breath and still remain positive in all conditions, because even this will pass away. You are in which city? You are in which university? I was asking her.
The JNU.
Oh, you are in JNU.
Yes, sir.
So JNU doesn't have psychology department?
No, we don't have, sir. I'm pursuing psychoanalysis. I'm part of another center, but my core area is that of psychoanalysis. I'm looking at literature, Hindi literature, and trying to analyze the narratives to create a discourse on childhood. That is my area.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So you are in the Department of Literature. You are in which department in JNU?
No, I'm in the Department of Education, Zakir Hussain Center of
Yes, yes.
Educational Studies,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
we have psychology as a
Yes, I
like as a discipline. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's like a,
Pedagogy and child psychology. Yeah, yeah.
yes,
A friend
yes,
of mine did a PhD from there. Yes, yeah.
yes, sir. Thank you.
So, okay, good.
Yeah. So anybody else? All right. It seems we don't have any more questions, Swamiji, for you today. Uh, so thank you. Thank you very much for joining us and for your precious time.